Welcome to the Expansionist Podcast with Shelley, Shepard, and Heather Drake. In each episode, we dive deep into conversations that challenge conventional thinking, amplify diverse voices, and foster a community grounded in wisdom, spirit, and love.
Merry Christmas to you, Heather Drake.
Happy Advent to you, Shelley Shepard.
What a delight to be here with you to share in this this week of joy. I am just so joyful today to have this time together. Thank you for that.
It is the week of joy in the liturgical calendar and in the understanding of where we are in this, the new year that started on December the 1st, that starts with this prepare the way, and are holding space to say, how are we preparing our own souls for the coming of Christ being born in us, of love being born of us, of peace being born from us? What does it look like for us to consider, for us to surrender, for us to acknowledge, and maybe even sit with the beautiful path that is shown to us by Mary? And we were talking last week about how joy is this defiance. It's an intentional defiance. And I love that idea of when despair is all around us, when war looms, when it can feel so overwhelming just to be present in the world that we're in, that joy says, there is something more. There's so much more. There's something to savor. There's good here. And so I'm so looking forward to our conversation and for holding these beautiful, empowering thoughts that say, what is it like for us to participate in holding peace within ourselves?
I heard a friend the other day say that that joy is more than being happy.
Yes.
It is this place of that joy comes when we're where we should be. And I thought that was an interesting way of talking about joy, because I think sometimes with the excitement of Advent and Christmas, there is this, I'm supposed to be bubbly and happy and like exuding all of these Christmassy kinds of thoughts and songs, and I'm just this happy person. But I think Advent teaches us that joy comes when we are where we need to be.
It's a fascinating thought to me that joy comes perhaps when you're where you need to be, but until that joy arrives, how do you know that you're where you need to be? I love that idea of the ordinary. And I think that's what we're gifted with in this part of the season is, according to the story that we're given, Mary is doing ordinary things when the angel appears to her and invites her to co-create with God. And so sometimes I think that we can become disheartened in our ordinary things. And one of the practices that you and I have held now for more than a year is paying attention to how sacred everything is. I mean, what kind of things could Mary have been doing? Probably, perhaps she was in the field, but this idea that she was probably doing, ancient housework where there was a lot of things to be done to prepare meals, to take care of animals, to take care of other family members. And it was in that place of her faithfulness in the ordinary that the extraordinary comes to her. And the extraordinary comes to her in this very cryptic way. And so to be able to say that you're going to have joy when you're in the right place, I mean, it's a fascinating thought, but I'm also thinking that joy to me reminds me that it's not always happiness, but joy comes from being anchored in love, that no matter what the situation is, no matter where I find myself, that I'm deeply connected to abiding love, to this belovedness, to this holiness that comes from abiding with God. And so, again, I'm fascinated by this subject. I think we could talk about Mary all the time and not exhaust it. Yeah. I think that she is such a beautiful model for us on how, I mean, she's in the way that we're gifted, the First Testament, where showed this woman's path to embodying the Christ. And then so the invitation is for us as women and as men. How do we allow Christ to be formed in us? How do we allow this peace? How do we allow mercy? How do we allow just the beauty that is the light of God. How do we allow that to be formed in us? And I think Mary has left us a beautiful path and a way to follow.
Do you think that that Mary had had her coffee, Heather, before the angel appeared?
I'm not sure she
Had she had
did.
her morning ritual? Had she taken her
She
quiet
may have
time?
had morning rituals, but the very fact that she said, "How can this be?" leads me to believe that maybe the French press hadn't all the way brewed. Like maybe she was in the middle of that, but it had not yet been 4 minutes, so she couldn't wrap her mind around how can this
Yes.
be. The messenger comes to her and says, "Hey, God wants to do this and wants to know if you want in on it." And then she thinks about the details. Okay, how can this be? And so I think that morning coffee also brings me a little clarity on how can this be.
Yeah.
And so maybe she hadn't had her coffee yet.
Yeah, we talk about these ordinary, these moments of joy happen in the ordinary. And for some people, that's coffee. For me, it's kombucha. For you, it's definitely French press coffee, right? But there's joy in that moment that might have nothing to do with the Christmas story. And yet, if you compound that joy over time, over many cups of coffee, over many glasses of kombucha, you get to a place of, wow, I want more of that kind of joy. I want joy when I'm walking on the path. I want joy when I'm riding my bike. I want joy when I'm serving in outreach. I want joy when I'm talking to a friend or visiting a neighbor or, at the hospital with somebody that is not going to make it. Joy begins to spill from the ordinary into the extraordinary. And I wonder if Mary, in that ordinary moment of her waking that morning, and this angelic presence appears, had she already prepared? You say she was hesitant.
Well,
The text
and
says,
I don't,
why me?
Yeah, I don't know that she was hesitant, but she certainly asked questions, and I
Of course.
commend her for that, as we all should. What is it going to look like for me to abandon ways of thinking that don't allow the shalom of God to be between me and my neighbor? What is it going to look like? And I'm sure Mary was capable of saying, I think this is important. You and I have talked about it, but the invitation here is to consent. The Spirit is up to something. The Spirit that hovered at creation over the chaos is once again going to hover over this feminine body and create something that is not only revolutionary, but is for the saving of the whole world. And so the invitation is, do you want to co-create with us? And I think that's what Jesus kept extending to us, this invitation. Will you allow the kingdom to be born in you? Will you allow the kingdom to be in the middle of you? Will you allow the reign of God's kingdom here among you? And she went from, how can this be? And her next response was, okay, let it be. Let it be unto me according to your word. And I love very much how the awe of seeing an angelic being offering to her an invitation of co-creating wasn't too extravagant. She got what she needed as far as, I don't know if she got details, but she had reassurance. And maybe the reassurance came from the fact that she already knew the Psalms and she knew that there was a promise of a Messiah coming, and she could lean back on the things that she had heard before. But there's certainly, until this point, we are at a unique place in history where we get to say we get to look back on the story, and so we know the end. But she just saw the very beginning. And so that took so much hope and so much courage and so much intention to say, be it unto me, according to your word.
She certainly, as a brown refugee female, was standing in a peculiar place.
Certainly vulnerable.
Yes, very vulnerable. And I believe the divinity that was present in that conversation to come to a woman with this invitation that would somehow make it even into our lives is
Yeah.
pretty phenomenal. It's pretty phenomenal to me that that God, that Yahweh, that Spirit took on this form to bring life, to bring joy, to bring peace, to bring hope, to bring love into the world. And yet it seems like it gets harder and harder to understand that point of the story, or to get people to believe, or to even grapple with, is this possible? Could this have even really happened? Is this some kind of myth or somebody's story that was made up in ancient ancestors and handed down?
Yeah. But stories are so powerful, and Jesus is the master of the metaphor himself, and he is the living word, the word made flesh. And so I prickle at the idea of somebody saying it's just a story. Stories are how we understand the
But you've
world.
heard people say that. You've heard
Yes,
people say
ma'am.
this is
Yes,
just a
yes,
story.
yes. Right. But there's always a deeper magic still, to quote C.S. Lewis. Like, there's so much more even under the story. But the stories are how we make sense of our world. And so to have a story that has been gifted to us and saying, this is what it looks like when this young woman says, how can this be? And then moves into let it be. And then this is the prayer that she prays. And then we're gifted some other words that she prays, the Magnificat. And then so many times we're listening to her. And then we hear a repetition in Jesus's words where he is in a place of vulnerability and he says, let it be unto me according to your word. Sounds like not my will, but yours be done. When Jesus says, this is my body broken for you, that it was first Mary whose body was broken.
That's right.
To bring the world, the incarnate of Christ here. And so her body broken, not only in childbirth, but broken as she continues to feed him, as she nurses him, as she goes through recovery of having this baby. There is so much brokenness that happens in a woman's life and in allowing the Christ. So to me, it's very hopeful when I see broken places. There's that beautiful lyric by Leonard Cohen, this is how the light gets in. And so in women's lives, I have such hope. The same thing when I see chaos and I'm like, oh, Spirit, come and hover here because look, we've made a giant mess. You can come here and empower us to live differently, to see differently, to change our way of thinking, to invite the Christ to be formed in us. This is the hope of the world, that light and love would always be seen in us, that we would be the hands and feet. There's the ancients who talk about Christ has no body here now except for yours. You are the body of Christ. And so I hear the song of Mary and I hear the prayers of Mary, and they inspire me in a way of following. What does it look like for me to say, I'm going to give up this way of thinking. I'm going to give up this plan. I'm going to give up this, whatever it is, because there's a bigger picture.
Are we asking that same question of ourselves every Advent, every Christmas, every season of the church? Are we asking ourselves about how that surrender looks like? If she was the first person to surrender to the incarnation, meaning I am going to I'm going to humble myself. I'm going to surrender. I'm going to accept this. I consent to this. Is that part of our posture? And have we forgotten how?
And if we've forgotten how, if that is the case, then we can look to Mary. And this is the beautiful
Mm,
invitation. I love that right after this happens, the next thing that we hear is that she goes to see Elizabeth. And she
right.
goes to see another woman and sort this out. Let me tell you what just
Absolutely.
happened to me. Let me tell you what I think I saw, what I think I heard. And in the presence of another woman, there is this confirmation. And so I love that this story is woven together in, between the young and the old, between women, between this hope for a world that is clearly in need of changing, in need of the miracle. And I find that that's feels like it's very replicated here. Like our world is in need
Hmm.
of a miracle. Our world is in need of a healer. And Mary showed us the path in bringing Jesus the healer before. And so the invitation is for us to prepare ourselves. What would it look like for you to prepare your mind that love would come and be formed in you, would be born in you, would be expressed through you in such a way that all of the goodness that God means for people to hear and to see would be something that they would witness in just being in our presence. That's exciting to me.
Hmm.
We want to pause and take a moment and let you know how glad we are that you've joined us. If you're enjoying this podcast, consider sharing it with a friend. And if you found the conversation intriguing and want to know more about what we're learning or how you can join our online community, visit our website at expansionisttheology.com.
Yes, and a beautiful hope as well. I wonder about the struggle with empire that Mary and Elizabeth. I'm going to sit with that for a second in their conversation as she entered Elizabeth's home and stayed there for a while with Elizabeth, and she was also pregnant with John, the Baptist, and knowing that they were in a situation where things were being controlled by empire. What was going through their minds, particularly as women in this situation? I just find myself fascinated in my holy imagination to think about the conversation that they were having. And then, lo and behold, the empire tries to, kill as soon as Jesus comes on the scene. Here comes the empire after the firstborn, and then they flee to Egypt. But the marginalization of this whole context, like what part of that can you and I identify with today in this story?
Well, I love that when she goes to see Elizabeth, Elizabeth greets her loudly and says, "The mother of my Lord." So something
Yes.
in Elizabeth identified the Christ that is being formed in Mary. And
Mm-hmm.
Elizabeth is the first one to acknowledge that lordship, that Christ. Okay, this is going to be the one that I follow. So clearly, this really deep connection Elizabeth has with the Spirit certainly has with her family here, but with this other woman. And then, before then, your question was, what was their interaction or what was their experience regarding empire? And I think that in the Song of Mary, where she begins to say, listen, the people that are wealthy, they're going to be turned away and they're going to have
Mm.
need. And the people that are powerful and are sitting on thrones, they're going to be brought low. And the people that have no voice are going to have a place to speak. And the words of this are so provocative that men in
Yeah. They
power
were
have
talking
said,
about their own context, right? They were talking about their own
yes,
context.
yes, yes. Men in power have said, do not read this out loud. Do not let people hear what this young girl allowed love, Christ, holiness, newness, God incarnate to be birthed in her. And then she began to say things like, hey, the way that things are, they're going to be turned upside down. This is not, the status quo is not status quo for the kingdom. The kingdom is
Mm-hmm.
coming. And now love is the great equalizer. And things are going to be different. And so the invitation to us is that same thing. What does it look like to allow love to be the great equalizer? Where love comes, love saves us, and love shows us there's a new way to live. And it's not through empire. It's not trusting in systems that continue to oppress people, but in the work of Spirit who's inviting us to live in a whole nother realm, a whole nother way.
Sometimes I think that this story is, it's definitely a story about the oppressed and oppression. But yet on the other side of that coin is this triumphant exclamation of, here I am, I'm ready, I surrender, I consent, I accept, here we go. Knowing that the male population was probably going to look at this situation a little bit differently than Mary and Elizabeth were seeing it. And then the story unfolds biblically from the perspective of, most of the Bible have been written by men, for men and by men. Here is this insertion of the feminine that I don't ever want to forget. I don't ever want to lose this moment in history where Yahweh, where God says, I am going to come through this woman. I am going to start my divinity right here with her. And yes, it's going to confound everybody coming and going. And there's going to be things written that are not true about her, about him. But here we go. I don't want to forget that part of the story. I always want that to be the part of Advent and Christmas that is intrinsically part of me. And I think that's where the feminine spirit of God is such a powerful force in the world and in my life that, wow, I can't see it any other way.
One of the paths that Mary took was the path that led her from awe into worship.
Mm.
And I wonder if for many of us, the awe has gone out of the things that we practice or the things that we allow ourselves to savor or the things that we look for, and looking for those moments of wonder, those moments of, is it possible that the Spirit is up to something completely different here? Is it possible that what I'm seeing with my natural eyes is not all that is happening here?
That's right.
And how can I get in on what God is doing here? How can I get in on this revolution that love is planning? What do I do to be a part of that? My own personal surrender, my own personal invitation, because in my surrender, in my freedom, it allows other people to be free. And so I'm not saying that this is my personal Jesus come only to save me. Certainly that is not the path that Mary showed us. This is her body breaking for all of us. This sounds very much like the words of Jesus that said, this is my body broken for you. Take it and eat, pass it out among you. All of you eat this. All of you become this way of living where from awe we move into wonder and worship, where it becomes this enchantment of, there is something else at work here.
And to me, that's the feminine perspective, Heather, is when we try to make this passageway of Emmanuel with us a theological posturing, a doctrine, a dogma, something that has come to save us and save us only. For me, it misses the point. It misses the point of that the feminine perspective, the feminine presence really has to be experienced in a different kind of way than, oh my goodness, than we've been experiencing it pretty much our entire lives, through an angry God, or through a God that people say that God hates people, or we don't want those folks in our country kind of conversations.
Mm.
Like it takes the feminine to me, in my experience, is that it is this open, inclusive, I give my consent to spirit. I surrender to this, and I am bringing the feminine side of God into the world through my own vessel. And so I have friends who do not see themselves as sacred, beloved, holy, anything. And I try to remind them that they are. And it started with Mary. This is our story. Mary's story is our story. It's the feminine story. It's how light breaks in. It's how love finds us. And so, yeah, perhaps maybe we've lost the awe and the wonder that leads to that kind of praise and that kind of experience. But, oh my goodness, if we could find that, if we could understand that this is where we are, where we could be, oh my goodness.
One of the things that strikes me in this story is the idea, not necessarily of knowing, but of being. Mary didn't know a lot of the details, but she was willing to be inconvenienced by the Spirit, or um, she was to be impassioned, emboldened, and also in this idea, this indwelling of God.
Mm-hmm.
And this is the promise for us. This is how it so relates to us, that what is it like for us to embody shalom? What does it look like for us to embody? And when you speak of the feminine, I'm sure that people have experienced many forms of feminine, but when you and I are discussing it in this matter, I remind you that it looks like the Spirit. It is gentle. The Spirit is long-suffering. The Spirit is kind. The Spirit is loving. The Spirit is all of these things. And so if by any reason we believe the Spirit to be harsh or condemning or flighty, all of those things do not sound like what the testimony of these women that actually lived through it, or what the Second Testament tells us the Spirit is like. I think that it's essential for us to be very mindful of the God that we have created in our own image.
Mm-hmm. Yes.
We
Agreed.
sometimes have a God who is vengeful or angry or is coming for our enemies, but we have a God who's sitting everyone down at the table and saying, everybody gets to come and eat. You prepare a table before me in the presence of my enemies. And, Mary is this beautiful invitation into a following of Christ. What is it like for her to be up at night with a sick toddler? This inconvenience. What is it up at night? And then we began talking last night about when she's at the wedding of Cana and she recognizes we don't have what we need. And somehow she knows the bigger story, that there is enough, that there is no scarcity, that the scarcity that they're actually experiencing is not the reality. And so she asks Jesus to do something about it.
Right.
And I wonder, does she ask him to do something about it because she just has this deep knowing? Or perhaps has she witnessed the way that abundance comes to him? And so she asks. And I love in that asking, can you do something for us? Would you do this? She doesn't say can, I don't think the language is the same. I think it's, would you fix this? Would you make this right? And then her leaning toward the other people that are there present and says, do whatever he tells you to do. That I think is the path of Mary, when you've heard the voice, when you've heard the voice above the noise, when you have identified it being spirit, will you do what the Spirit tells you to do? Whatever
Yes.
Jesus tells you to do that.
Mm.
Because maybe it's not the same every time. Maybe she had seen, different kind of miracles or different kind of abundance or a different kind of seeing. Maybe she had so much confidence that whatever it is that he tells you, follow that, because that's where you're going to find the reward. That's where you're going to find the answer.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. It's a beautiful tapestry that has been handed down and protected, even in its form that we have it now. It's just a beautiful story, particularly about the women, Elizabeth and Mary, and what they give us in this season and in this time, but also what they teach us in our rituals and how we show up and how we surrender and how we continue to find the path of resistance against the empire, perhaps.
It was our joy to have you listen to our conversation today. If you would like further information or for more content, visit us at expansionisttheology.com.